a deep dive into the world of Harvest Moon. When it comes to video games, there's no denying that in this day and age, we're absolutely spoiled for choice. Whether you're a hardcore gamer or a casual player, there seems to be something for everyone. From glamorous dress-up games, to adrenaline-pumping MMORPGs, to life simulators where the sky's the limit. But amongst all of these options, who would have guessed that a game all about farming would take root in the hearts of millions? During an era of final bosses and fatalities, the Story of Seasons franchise, or as you might know it, Harvest Moon, defied all expectations. By taking the simple and somewhat boring concept of tending crops and caring for animals and making it entertaining, Harvest Moon effectively paved the way for the entire farming game genre. That's right, Stardew Valley fans, you owe Harvest Moon your life. But don't be fooled by the game's laid-back countryside setting. The tale of Harvest Moon is anything but simple. In today's video, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the creation of the series, its dozens of installments, its influence on the gaming industry, and the future of the franchise. So grab some wild grape juice and your virtual hoe, and get ready to unearth the story of how a Japanese farming game became a beloved classic. But first, a word from our sponsor, Lovin' Pies, the adorable mobile game where you can help Amelia build a cafe, grow her business, make delicious pastries, find romance, and even unearth a few mysteries. What more could you ask for? Lovin' Pies is celebrating their 2-year anniversary with 2 weeks of exclusive content and real-life baking contests. I'm no Amelia, but I wanted to make my own chocolate chip cookies to join in on the fun. If you're confident in your baking skills, you can join the Bakeout Birthday Bash on the official Lovin' Pies Instagram and Facebook pages, where you stand a chance of winning some awesome prizes. My favorite part of the game is being able to customize my cafe however I want to, which is honestly way more fun than it should be. And if you play in the next 2 weeks, you can even get an exclusive in-game decoration item. So join in on the delicious birthday fun and download Lovin' Pies for free today. Now let's get back to the video. Video games initially took off in the United States in the late 1970s, an era referred to as the golden age of arcades. Although the budding industry was initially composed of game developers who had a passion for the medium, after seeing how profitable the market was, numerous companies were formed with the sole intention of making cheap clones of the most popular games. The oversaturation of these half-assed games eventually became one of the leading factors behind the video game crash of 1983, which saw revenue plummeting from $3 billion to a measly $100 million in only 2 years. While the US was recovering from this crash, Japan's gaming industry was miraculously thriving, thanks in large part to Nintendo and the legendary Mario. Arcades were buzzing, consoles were flying off the shelves, and action games were the talk of the town. So with all of this competition, how on earth did a little game about farming become so popular? Yasuhiro Wada, a Japanese video game designer and producer, first came up with the idea as a response to the barrage of combat-heavy role-playing games like Final Fantasy. Inspired by his childhood in the countryside, Wada envisioned a peaceful oasis that could be a break from the virtual violence, and sought to replicate the rural life he missed, complete with lovingly tended livestock and farm-fresh produce. The original concept of the series was rather simple and focused on raising cows, something which was partially inspired by the video game Derby Stallion. The initial premise was considered far too boring, so Wada implemented a battle system in the form of farming and human interaction, which took inspiration from SimCity and The Legend of Zelda. Now, getting the game off the ground was no easy task. After the original publisher, Pack-In Video, went bankrupt in 1996 and was merged with Victor Entertainment to create Victor Interactive Software, Wada's development team was downsized, shrinking from 10 members to only 3, including himself. The future of his peaceful farming game looked bleak, and Wada was ready to call it quits, but the remaining members of his team, Setsuko Miyakoshi and Tomomi Yamatate, didn't allow him to give up. In order to make their 6-month deadline, the trio hunkered down in a meeting room with their sleeping bags and equipment, working endless hours for weeks to complete the project. During this crunch time, the original code was completely scrapped and rewritten by Yamatate, while the script and graphics were compiled by Miyakoshi, and Wada handled overall design, dialogue, and playtesting. All of this hard work thankfully paid off in the end, as they were able to turn in a working prototype just in time. Bokujo Monogatari was eventually released in Japan by Pack-In Video on August 9, 1996. A mere 2 months after the release of the popular N64, expectations for the SNES-compatible game were incredibly low, and upon its release it managed to only sell 20,000 units. However, the few people who had purchased the game couldn't stop raving about it, and through the power of word of mouth, Bokujo Monogatari's sales increased to over 100,000 in just a few months. After seeing the buzz surrounding the game, Victor Interactive Software decided to take it international, with Natsume Incorporated publishing the game in North America and Nintendo in Europe. Roughly translated, Bokujo Monogatari means farm story, but when it made its ways overseas, the name was changed by Natsume to Harvest Moon, a phenomenon which refers to the full moon that occurs at the beginning of fall, which was so bright that it allowed farmers to harvest their crops late into the night, which in a pre-electricity age was like magic. Aside from the name, other aspects of the game were also changed to better suit its Western audience, like the North American version changing all references to alcohol to juice instead. However, they didn't remove all of the Japanese cultural elements, with the townspeople discussing religion in Shinto terms and the main character eating an onigiri.
Have a donut, that always cheers me up. Pika pika!
These donuts are great! Jelly-filled are my favorite! Nothing beats a jelly-filled donut!
The game's premise, simple. Restore and maintain a rundown farm inherited from the main character's deceased grandfather. But the execution? That's where things got more complicated. Over 2.5 years in-game, the player had to juggle tasks like planting, harvesting, foraging, raising livestock, upgrading their farm, and more. Character locations, shop openings, and other elements varied based on the time and day, injecting realism into the virtual farming world. While initially intended to be relaxing, the actual gameplay was more challenging than you'd expect. Each year in-game was divided into 4 seasons of 30 days each, with the player having to sow seeds in their designated seasons and harvest them at the right time to ship them off. In order for your crops to mature, they have to be watered every day, and unlike how gardening works in the real world, lack of water in the game didn't kill the crops, but prevented them from growing. You could raise cows and chickens, which required different levels of attention in order for them to continue producing. Cows would produce milk, which could be turned into cheese and butter, while chickens produced eggs. The only care that chickens required was feeding, but cows had to be continually talked to, brushed, and milked to retain their health. Unlike many other games, if an animal's illness was left untreated or they were left outside overnight, it was possible that they could die, which is kind of dark for a game that was advertised as peaceful, but hey, at least it's realistic. The player could also choose a dog or a cat as a pet. If a cat was chosen, wild dogs wouldn't attack chickens, and if a dog was picked, moles wouldn't destroy crops. The player could also get a horse early in the game, which could be raised for farm work, riding, and shipping items. The main character, whose default name was Pete, has since become the face of the franchise, and is easily recognized by his blue overalls, white shirt, and green cap. The game included a dating sim mechanic where the player would have to increase the affection of different bachelorettes in order to eventually pick one to marry and have kids with. The eligible bachelorettes included 5 girls: Anne, who lives in the tool shop and loves working with machines; Nina, who lives in the flower shop and is very in tune with nature; Ellen, who lives at the restaurant with her parents and loves to bake; Eve, who works at the bar and is described as outgoing, wild, and flirtatious; and lastly, Maria, a religious girl living at the mayor's mansion who enjoys playing the organ and reading. The first dating simulator game, Dokyusei, was created in Japan in 1992, but was a good deal more mature than Harvest Moon, having erotic scenes and racy dialogue. Although Harvest Moon wasn't the first video game that allowed players to virtually romance other characters, it has become one of the most recognizable aspects of its gameplay, and was many non-Japanese gamers' introduction to the concept. Despite initial skepticism, Harvest Moon became a hit, with a review from Electronic Gaming Monthly saying, quote, "An RPG about farming? Talk about a hard sell. But this epic adventure in agriculture is as fun as it is original." Following all of the praise directed at its unusual premise and entertaining gameplay, a second installment of Harvest Moon entered development, turning what could have been a one-hit wonder into the start of a fruitful series. In 1997, just a year after the game made its debut in Japan, Harvest Moon GB was launched. Developed and published by Victor Interactive Software for the Game Boy, this marked the first portable entry in the Harvest Moon lineup, with the game being far simpler, both in terms of graphics and gameplay, to its predecessor. A Game Boy Color version was released 2 years later, but did little to elevate the overall quality, with the graphics lacking the detail and charm of the original SNES game. While the game retained many of the beloved elements from the original Harvest Moon, several differences set it apart. The male protagonist from the first game, Pete, made his return, but he was joined by a new female protagonist, Sarah. This allowed the player to choose which character they wanted to play as, bringing an entirely new level of customization to the series. Although the game was praised for the inclusion of a new main character, it had the unfortunate side effect of limiting gameplay, with the popular romance function being noticeably absent despite the same bachelorettes making appearances. Instead of the protagonist's parents leaving them in charge of the farm, the player is instead visited by the ghost of their deceased grandfather, who implores them to become a ranch master, stating that he'll check up on them at the end of each winter to determine their progress. The player can reach this goal by developing the farm, growing and selling crops, and raising livestock. If successful, the player may receive extra tools as a reward, but if not, a game over is given. Like its predecessor, Harvest Moon GB emphasized farming, with crops being the primary source of income. Additionally, players could harvest mushrooms from their underground cellar, a new feature unique to this installment. Another new addition were the harvest sprites, tiny elf-like magical beings who, if befriended, would help around the farm. The adorable color-coded harvest sprites would proceed to become staples of the franchise. Reception towards Harvest Moon GB was mixed. GameSpot praised the game as a, quote, relaxing and rewarding simulation of the simple life on the farm, but others were less forgiving about the removal of the dating mechanic, with IGN criticizing it for being a, quote, lightweight version of a feathery game. Released in February 1999 for the Nintendo 64, Harvest Moon 64 marked a significant evolution for the franchise, most notable being its enhanced graphics. The game also added new animals, crops, recipes, and characters. Amongst fans, the game is renowned for being extraordinarily difficult, with extreme constraints on time and stamina being introduced, making it one of the hardest games in the series to achieve a perfect ending. There were also required quests and events, which if missed, would have to be completed the following year, affecting the player's overall progression, or worse, sometimes forcing them to completely start over. Despite complaints surrounding its difficulty, it remains one of the highest rated entries in the Harvest Moon series. The game had the same premise as the other installments, with Pete's grandfather leaving him the neglected farm. But this time around, Pete is challenged to improve it by his father, who will evaluate his progress after 9 seasons, resulting in one of several endings. Where this game differs is that the player's success is more reliant on their relationship with the townspeople, who are struggling with their own personal challenges that the player needs to resolve. The game is believed to be set after the original events in Harvest Moon, as Ellen, one of the earliest bachelorettes, makes an appearance as an old woman. Ellen also becomes the first character in Harvest Moon who can die, an action that completely relies on how the character interacts with her. This installment reverted back to a male-only protagonist, unfortunately leaving no option for a female character, but the ability to marry and have a child did make a triumphant return. Players were able to woo 5 eligible bachelorettes, each with distinct personalities, interests, and rival suitors who could marry them if you didn't. Their affection towards the player was represented by hearts that appeared in their dialogue boxes, ranging from white for indifference to pink for love. Ellie, Ellen's granddaughter, manages Flower Bud Bakery and confides in the player about her body image concerns, which was unfortunately less progressive than one would hope, with the resolution of this theme relying on the male character's reassurance rather than Ellie's own self-realization. Karen, a character initially perceived as lazy and harsh, shows her vulnerable side as the player grows closer to her, revealing her concerns about her family's vineyard, which can be restored if her storyline quests are completed. However, if the player chose to not befriend her, she would eventually leave the town because of her unhappiness. Anne, a bold tomboy and Karen's best friend, adores animals, and as her relationship with the player progresses, she'll begin sharing tips on how to care for them. Potpourri, a sunny, upbeat girl with a love for flowers, will marry Anne's brother Gray if the player doesn't marry her, with the two eventually having a daughter named Mint. Maria, the daughter of the town's mayor, is shy but sweet, and works as the local librarian. There's practically no difference between her and the original Maria apart from their appearance, but I guess if something ain't broke, why fix it? Harvest Moon 2 GBC was released a few months after Harvest Moon 64, and served as a sequel to Harvest Moon GB. Although apart from taking place in Flower Bud Village, the primary setting for the franchise thus far, there's nothing else that actually connects the two. In a narrative twist, the player is tasked with improving the lackluster farm not to please their grandfather, but in order to prevent the land from being turned into an amusement park, a premise that would proceed to be used multiple times throughout the series. As with the previous Game Boy game, you could choose to play as either Pete or Sarah, but as a result, marriage was once again unavailable. Because the game emphasized the farming aspects more so than relationship building, there were numerous additions to gameplay, including more species of fish, the ability to capture insects, gender-specific crops, and the construction of a greenhouse. In a nod to the growing trend of inter-game connectivity, Harvest Moon 2 introduced a trading feature through the Game Link cable where players could swap fish, insects, and even flowers with other players who owned Harvest Moon 2 and, strangely enough, Legend of the River King 2. This feature not only encouraged player interaction, but also added an element of exclusivity, with certain species only being available through trades. The game was received far more favorably than Harvest Moon GB, with critics and players lauding its expansive world and refined farming mechanics, but still expressing disappointment at the removal of the dating sim. The final release of 1999 was Harvest Moon Back to Nature, which marked a major milestone for the series, becoming the first to be made for a non-Nintendo platform, the PlayStation. Unlike previous entries, which either locked players into a male protagonist or offered a choice between genders, Back to Nature introduced a separate game centered around a female lead. This counterpart, initially launched in Japan in 2000, bore the rather on-the-nose title Harvest Moon for Girl, but wouldn't be available in the West until 2007. The game was similar to that of previous installments, but now took place in Mineral Town instead of Flowerbud Village. Many of the characters were taken from Harvest Moon 64, but with slight modifications including different personalities, occupations, and families. This created a minor controversy amongst fans, as it directly contradicted what had previously been established in the Harvest Moon canon. These changes included Ellie working as a nurse instead of at the bakery, Potpourri's love rival now being Kai, who was previously linked to Karen, Anne no longer having a brother, Maria's name changing to Mary, and Gray becoming the grandson of the town's blacksmith. Many of these changes would carry over into future installments of Harvest Moon, making Back to Nature one of the most influential titles in the entire franchise. In 2000, the Game Boy trilogy reached its conclusion with the release of Harvest Moon 3 GBC. This installment remains particularly notable for its unique approach to gender. Depending on the character you chose, you would receive different cutscenes and a slightly different storyline. If you chose the male character, it would continue where Harvest Moon 2 left off, with Pete successfully saving the farm from being turned into an amusement park. He would then be told by the mayor that the daughter of his deceased friend will be taking over the property, but doesn't know the first thing about farming, and asks that you help her get started. If you selected Sarah, it'd be a similar scenario but from her perspective, with her moving to Flowerbud Village after the death of her father and being assisted by Pete. Although the partner system had potential, it wound up becoming quite the controversial addition as each gender was pigeonholed into specific roles on the farm. The female character was entrusted with animal care and the production of animal products like yarn, while the male character dealt with crops and wielded the upgradable tools. In a strange reinforcement of dated gender stereotypes, Pete also had greater stamina than Sarah did. Although this was the first Harvest Moon game with gender options that had the dating sim, it was criticized for being rather limited, as Pete could only marry Sarah, or vice versa. Annoyingly, if you selected the female character and got married, that would abruptly end the game, with a cutscene of Pete and Sarah with their child. Whereas if you chose the male storyline, you were able to continue playing unhindered post-marriage. What a great message for kids. These decisions by the developers led to criticism, with the game being labeled as both sexist and out of touch. Nevertheless, Harvest Moon 3 garnered decent reviews, with critics commending its vibrant graphics and intricate gameplay. In 2001, the Harvest Moon series moved into the third dimension with Harvest Moon Save the Homeland on the PlayStation 2, a decision that wasn't well received by its fans. Although Harvest Moon 64 and Harvest Moon Back to Nature had 2.5D designs, the introduction of full 3D in Save the Homeland led to character models that didn't really match the game's comparatively muted terrains. The game introduced a new protagonist, Toy, also called Tony, who inherits his late grandfather's farm and upon arrival encounters 3 harvest sprites, Nick, Knack, and Flack, and the harvest goddess, who persuade him to help them. Tony learns that the entire town is on the brink of demolition, destined to be replaced by a resort and amusement park within a year. Therefore, his primary mission is to rescue the town from this impending fate. To do so, the player had to navigate a series of choices that led to one of 9 distinct endings. These endings were reliant on which villagers Tony chose to befriend, with each having a unique quest that needed to be completed. After successfully achieving an ending, players could restart the game, retaining their money and animals, and then pursue a different outcome. Faithful to its predecessors, Save the Homeland still incorporated familiar farming mechanics like cultivating crops and tending to livestock. But unlike many of the other Harvest Moon games, which were rather cavalier about the death of animals, Save the Homeland took it way more seriously. In the event one of your animals died, there would be a dramatic cutscene which would force the player to refrain from working in order to reflect on his mistakes, and the death of the animal would also negatively impact his relationships with other characters. Although you could still romance some of the new villagers, there were no options for marriage or parenthood. Despite its innovations, Save the Homeland received modest feedback, with criticisms being directed at the game's simplicity and the disregard of its iconic dating mechanics. 8 years later, the game would be remade for the PSP as Harvest Moon: Hero of Leaf Valley, having the exact same premise, but instead of 9 endings, Hero of Leaf Valley had 16, not only giving players more storylines to explore, but also increasing the replayability of the game. Another significant addition was the option for marriage, with extra characters being introduced, which added an extra layer of engagement and emotional investment for players. If the player was successful in saving the village from being turned into an amusement park, the player's second challenge was earning a specific amount of money before the end of the 3rd year. Although it was seen as an improvement on Save the Homeland, Hero of Leaf Valley isn't as well remembered as other Harvest Moon installments. In 2003, Victor Interactive Software merged with Marvelous Entertainment, making Harvest Moon: Friends of Mineral Town the first game in the series to be released through their new developer, Marvelous Interactive. Released for the Game Boy Advance, Friends of Mineral Town was met with enthusiasm for bringing back the game's signature 2D graphics and the franchise's main protagonist, Pete. It also brought back beloved features like recurring festivals and gave players a closer look at Mineral Town's spirited community. The game had a slightly different introduction than most, with Pete meeting a farmer while on a family trip and befriending him, eventually being given his farm after he passes. Apart from that, the game was incredibly similar to Back to Nature, just with additional heart events, recipes, mythic tools, homes, harvest sprites, lore, and characters. The game also made the Harvest Goddess, a staple of the series, a secret bachelorette, meaning that for the first time you could marry and have children with her. However, she was significantly more difficult to woo than the rest of the bachelorettes, requiring the completion of several challenging quests in order to propose. In tandem with Friends of Mineral Town, the developers also launched a female-centric version named More Friends of Mineral Town. Like 2000's Harvest Moon for Girl, the gender-swapped version is practically identical to its male counterpart, just with a slightly different introduction and marriage prospects. Claire is initially living in the big city when she sees an ad about the farm and spontaneously moves to Mineral Town on the promise of a peaceful and refreshing life. When she arrives, she finds that the property has no resemblance to what she saw in the ad, but she decides to stay anyway, but not until after she attacks the mayor for tricking her. All of the previous male rivals are now available as marriageable bachelors, with 3 special bachelors also being possible. Cliff is a shy young man who is temporarily living in Mineral Town. If the player doesn't befriend him and help him find a job within the first year, he moves away, forcing Anne to be single forever. The doctor is solely focused on his work and little else, making him oblivious to Ellie's affections. Rick, Potpourri's brother, harbors resentment towards his father for leaving the family, even if it was to find a cure for his mother's illness. And although he means well, his short temper can be off-putting. Gray is a rather angry young man who's come from the city to live in Mineral Town to work as an apprentice blacksmith, but he mellows out as you befriend him. Kai is one of the most difficult of the standard bachelors to romance, as he only comes to Mineral Town in the summer, but he'll begin living there full-time if the player marries him. The 3 secret bachelors are Gourmet, the judge of the cooking festival, Juan, a traveling salesman, and the Kappa, a magical green creature that lives in the lake and adores cucumbers. Like the Harvest Goddess, in order to marry them, you had to fulfill special requirements. Aside from the occasional translation hiccups, these games are considered the creme de la creme of the Harvest Moon franchise, often being hailed as fan favorites. In fact, they were actually what started my love for Harvest Moon. Do you think you can guess which bachelor and bachelorette I always chased after? In 2003, Harvest Moon: A Wonderful Life was released for the GameCube, and is widely considered to be one of the most unique installments into the series to date. As the name suggests, A Wonderful Life followed the main character, Mark, from early adulthood to old age, with the NPCs growing older as time passed as well. Taking place in Forget-Me-Not Valley, the village is populated entirely by new characters, including 3 new bachelorettes. There's Celia, a friendly vegetable farmer, Muffy, the local barmaid who is struggling to adapt to the countryside after moving from the city, and Nami, who is the most difficult to woo. In the 2004 enhanced release, A Wonderful Life Special Edition, a 4th bachelorette, Lumina, was added, who is a shy and artsy orphan who blossoms as the game progresses. This is the first Harvest Moon game where the player could raise their child all the way from infancy to adulthood. Depending on which bachelorette you married, your son would have a different appearance, interests, and talents. By taking the child to different locations, introducing him to people, and giving him gifts, you can continue to influence his developing personality, which will help him choose which of the 6 possible careers he wants to pursue at the end of the game. This brought an entirely new level of interactivity to Harvest Moon, almost making it more reminiscent of The Sims, and fans praised the multi-generational narrative. As was customary, a gender swap version, Another Wonderful Life, was released shortly after. The main character, Pony, can marry 3 different bachelors: Marlin, a sourpuss who is slowly dying from an unknown illness, Gustafa, a traveling musician who's searching for his muse, and Rock, a lazy freeloader who constantly complains about how boring the town is. I have absolutely no idea why they made all of the bachelors so terrible. Although an ambitious venture, A Wonderful Life had its flaws. The absence of festivals and limited upgrades meant that gameplay could be rather repetitive, and with the game's extended timeline, reaching the end could be a tedious endeavor. Harvest Moon: Magical Melody was released for the GameCube in 2005. While other installments like Save the Homeland opted for a more anime-adjacent art style, Magical Melody returned to the franchise's roots with a chibi-inspired look that resonated with fans. Other improvements included allowing the player to select a male or female protagonist in a single game, doing away with gender-specific additions. This resulted in the addition of Adam, who was identical to Pete, and his sister Amanda as possible protagonists. The primary objective in Magical Melody was to collect a total of 100 musical notes in order to resurrect the Harvest Goddess, although in actuality, only 50 were needed to win the game. While you could continue playing to get all 100, few players were incentivized to do so, as that ending was far less rewarding. This game had the most marriage candidates so far, with 11 of each gender. Multiple characters from Harvest Moon 64, and Save the Homeland made reappearances, although some of their names and storylines were changed to better fit Magical Melody. If the player let their friendship with these characters get too low, or failed to ship certain items, they would move out of town, requiring a significant amount of work to get them to move back in. The game also had a secret marriage candidate, Jamie, who could be married regardless of the gender of your character. However, if you chose to do so, the game would immediately end, and return the character to their last save point before proposing to Jamie. This was one of the best received Harvest Moon game in years, nearing but not quite surpassing the acclaim of Harvest Moon 64. In March 2005, Harvest Moon DS was released, and intended to capitalize on one of the biggest trends in gaming.
I found my way to Forget-Me-Not Valley, where I made some new friends. I relaxed, looking after plants in my garden, and cared for my animals.
Although the game implemented the Nintendo DS's touch controls, it failed to live up to fans' expectations, in large part because of the numerous glitches that severely impacted gameplay. The game was a combination of Friends of Mineral Town and A Wonderful Life, which on paper seemed like a winning formula, but the game's main task, which required the player to rescue the Harvest Goddess and 101 harvest sprites from the Witch Princess, seemed too fantastical for a game that had at least attempted to be rooted in reality previously. Although the game featured most of the same characters as A Wonderful Life, another normal bachelorette was added, Flora, and 3 special bachelorettes, the Witch Princess, Leia, and Kira. Harvest Moon DS Cute, the gender swap version, attempted to fix some of the criticisms directed at the initial male release by including new events, a slightly altered storyline, and had the option to play as Claire or Pony. The game also famously introduced a same-sex marriage mechanic, referred to as the best friend system, but it was removed from Western editions of the game. Like Another Wonderful Life, the bachelor options were surprisingly lackluster, even with new additions Griffin, Carter, and Sky. If I'm being honest, Sky was really the only decent option, and that boy was a literal criminal, so that's how low the bar was. It's worth noting that that same year, the DS also saw the release of Animal Crossing Wild World, which quickly became Harvest Moon DS's biggest competition. While at their core, both games were relaxing farming simulators, the gameplay was vastly different. When it was first released back in 2001, Animal Crossing made a name for itself with its open-ended gameplay, real-time mechanics, and customization features. As a sequel to the massively popular game, Wild World had a lot of pressure on it to meet fans' expectations, which it easily surpassed, becoming one of the most beloved games for the Nintendo DS, selling 325,460 units in Japan the first week of release. Meanwhile, Harvest Moon DS sold only 28,312 units in the same amount of time. This difference in sales made it clear that even though Harvest Moon may have introduced the world to farming games, it was struggling to grow its audience and remain relevant. Although Harvest Moon wasn't making as much noise as it once had, its developers, Marvelous Interactive, refused to give up on the concept, eventually resulting in the creation of 2 spin-off series. The less popular of the 2 was Innocent Life, a futuristic Harvest Moon, which was released for the PSP in 2006. Although it was advertised as a farming sim, it was more like a traditional RPG, with Life, an android, needing to complete certain tasks in order to unlock different areas of Heartflame Island. The game received mixed reviews and performed poorly commercially, and as a result, no further installments were made. Rune Factory, a fantasy Harvest Moon, was released for the DS that same year, just in time for the 10th anniversary of the Harvest Moon franchise. Like the main series, Rune Factory included farming mechanics and marriage candidates, but had a larger emphasis on fighting and fantasy, with longtime Harvest Moon producer Yoshifumi Hashimoto once describing the game as, quote, Harvest Moon where you wield a sword. Taking place in the small city of Cardia, the main character, Raguna, begins working on a farm after an injury which causes him to forget who he is. Although the game is open-ended, meaning the player is free to do whatever they want, the only way to actually progress is by having Raguna defeat monsters, and in doing so, he begins to regain his memories. Although the first few games boldly announced their connection to Harvest Moon, as the years passed, Rune Factory dropped any references to the farming game it had taken inspiration from in an attempt to build its reputation as an independent series, which definitely worked, as Rune Factory has since released 8 total games, several manga, and 2 spin-offs. In 2007, Harvest Moon Island of Happiness was released, and brought with it new protagonists Mark and Chelsea, with whichever one you didn't choose to play as becoming an eligible marriage candidate. Island of Happiness introduced a new continuity and setting, as well as a dozen new characters, with the Witch Princess and Harvest Goddess being the only familiar faces. Julia and Denny were my favorites of these new recruits. Although this new island setting was intriguing, the gameplay received criticism, with crops being incredibly finicky and characters leaving the island if you forgot to talk to them for a few days, a mechanic that was clearly inspired by Magical Melody. The game's controls also left much to be desired. By forcing players to only use the DS touchscreen, what used to take a couple of button presses in earlier titles was now a laborious process that could take 5 times as long. 2 years later, they would release Sunshine Islands, which was effectively a remake of Island of Happiness with an adjusted storyline. While Island of Happiness followed the typical Harvest Moon formula with the player needing to fix up an abandoned ranch, in Sunshine Islands they're tasked with finding the magical sunstones in order to raise the sunken islands. A new bachelor, Will, and bachelorette, Lily, were also added. Unlike Island of Happiness, the player was able to use other DS controls besides the touchscreen, instantly making gameplay more enjoyable. In 2007, Harvest Moon Tree of Tranquility was released for the Nintendo Wii, resulting in an art style change that I strongly dislike. You can't tell me that Calvin doesn't look like Crocodile Dundee and a water balloon had a baby. The story is once again moved to a new setting, Waffle Island. Here, the protagonist, Kevin or Angela, takes on the monumental task of restoring the lost harvest goddess and therefore the island's ecosystem. Besides introducing 8 new bachelors and bachelorettes, Tree of Tranquility also added in some new animals like ostriches and silkworms and introduced a new planting system. However, the game had its setbacks, the most glaring being the absurdly slow pacing, which turned an otherwise peaceful gaming experience into an agonizing one. But perhaps the most eyebrow-raising aspect of Tree of Tranquility was its awkward post-game narrative. After completing a lengthy quest and watching your child grow up, you can opt to start anew as your offspring. However, your avatar remains identical to what you'd previously selected. The dialogue doesn't change, and most disturbingly, you can even marry your original spouse, leading to some questionable family dynamics. In 2008, another Wii game, Harvest Moon Animal Parade, was released, and I find it just as disconcerting to look at as its predecessor, although other fans consider it a return to form for the series. Marketed as a sequel to Tree of Tranquility, Animal Parade had a very similar eco-friendly premise, and featured the same cast of characters, albeit with two new protagonists, Molly and Casey. The player must once again restore the power of nature, this time by ringing 5 mystical bells guarded by the Harvest Sprites, which will summon the Harvest King who will bring the island back to life permanently. As the name suggests, there was a heavy emphasis on animals, offering a wider variety than most other games in the series, and allowing you to interact with them in new ways. The game was also praised for addressing many of the issues that plagued Tree of Tranquility, like its slow loading times and sluggish pacing. For the first time, players could have 2 children instead of just 1, and not only were there various milestones in a child's life that the player could experience, but they could also assist with farm responsibilities as they got older. These children's appearances and personalities varied depending on which character the player chose to marry, adding more customizability to your gaming experience and providing a more interesting family dynamic. Unfortunately, this wound up being the last entry in the franchise that was overseen by series creator Yasuhiro Wada, something often pinpointed as the beginning of the end for Harvest Moon. 2009's Harvest Moon Grand Bazaar took the story in a brand new direction by making the focus of the game not your dilapidated farm, but the once famous bazaar of Zephyrtown, which previously attracted customers from all over the world. The player's main objective is to bring the bazaar back to its former glory by selling their farm's produce and other goods. The bazaar opens every week for a limited period of time, and had a twist. Players weren't just trying to sell their own wares, but also had to compete with other vendors to earn the most. The top 3 vendors were awarded prizes, and the more you earned, the more the bazaar expanded, bringing in new shops and opportunities. Customer interaction also played a significant role in the game, with NPCs coming to your stall to make specific requests or seek advice, and fulfilling their demands increased your satisfaction ratings. With the new location brought new characters, including 2 new protagonists the player could choose from, Hansel and Gretel, no doubt a reference to their German-inspired clothing. The game introduced 5 new bachelors and bachelorettes, who, unlike in prior installments, had friends and family that you also had to befriend in order to get married. These new marriage candidates included Sherry, Antoinette, Daisy, Amiko, Freya, Amir, Angelo, Dirk, Ivan, and Lloyd, with many having their own stall at the bazaar. Despite being a unique twist on the usual Harvest Moon format, being more reminiscent of a business simulator game, Grand Bazaar received lukewarm reception overall, although I personally find it to be one of the most visually appealing installments in years, especially compared to the Wii games. In 2011, the final Harvest Moon game for the Nintendo DS hit shelves, The Tale of Two Towns. The game centers around the neighboring towns Bluebell and Konohana, which were once friendly but are now bitter rivals. The player, Lillian or Philip, is eager to begin life on their new farm, but after becoming injured while traveling, they forget which town they were supposed to move to. The player must then pick whichever town they like best, and over the course of the game attempt to mend the relationship between the two. The game's most significant departure from previous entries was this dual town concept. Bluebell was more animal-focused, while Konohana specialized in crops. This choice provided a new layer of strategy and customization, as each town had its own unique advantages. Although players could only live in one place, they could still visit the other town and even marry its residents. Some returning characters included Alyssa from Island of Happiness and Dirk from Grand Bazaar, but the rest of the NPCs were new additions, including the 6 bachelors and bachelorettes. Instead of the iconic heart system, a chain of flowers was instead used to symbolize a character's affection levels, which, while cute, wasn't as eye-catching. This would also be the final entry in the franchise that allowed the player to have children. In the latter half of the 2000s, the quality of the Harvest Moon games had become inconsistent and their sales were on the decline, all the while the farming genre was steadily growing in popularity online. Happy Farm, Farmville, and other similar freemium social network games quickly became Harvest Moon's biggest competitors, capitalizing on the increasing trend of casual gaming. Released in 2009, Farmville was easily accessible, free to play, and had a social component that allowed users to help each other on their respective farms. I was personally never that into Farmville, as I couldn't help but negatively compare it to Harvest Moon, but other Facebook games like Pet Society and Cafe World had me right where they wanted me. Although Farmville's business model attracted criticism for encouraging players to spend real-world money to accelerate their in-game progress, it was massively successful, making it the farming game of the early 2010s, with the game peaking at over 83 million monthly active users on Facebook. It was once such a phenomenon that sequel games were even made available as mobile apps, and multiple farming knockoffs like Farmtown, Country Story, and Happy Harvest were released to try and ride the wave. Compared to the Harvest Moon franchise, Farmville was far more simple and repetitive, lacking any sort of storyline that prompted long-term engagement, which was reflected in the game's severe decline in popularity in 2011. Harvest Moon would release their own browser game, Let's All Harvest Moon, for the Japanese social network site Mixi in 2010, where it attracted 2.3 million users. This attempt to compete with Farmville was hardly a massive success, with the game shutting down in 2012 and becoming a form of lost media. Harvest Moon: A New Beginning was released in 2012 for the Nintendo 3DS. The game was set in Echo Village, a near-empty town that had been negatively affected by the poor economy. It follows a classic Harvest Moon storyline, with the player, Henry or Rachel, being given an abandoned farm that needs to be cared for. Besides featuring a new cast of characters, the only major difference to gameplay is that the player must restore the town as well as the farm. A New Beginning drew comparisons to other popular farming games like Animal Crossing and Farmville due to its extensive customization features, with players being given unprecedented control over their character's appearance and the look of the village and farm. There was, however, one notable drawback: the pacing, with many features being locked behind progress gates. All things considered, it hardly seemed like a new beginning, with the game effectively being a copy of prior Harvest Moon installments, just for a different console. After working together for over a decade, longtime Harvest Moon publisher Natsume and developer Marvelous parted ways, with the two disagreeing on their vision for the future of the franchise, resulting in the series splitting into two separate entities. As the publisher, Natsume held the rights to the Harvest Moon name and logo, which is why the oft-forgotten Harvest Moon: The Lost Valley still retains the series' iconic name in English-speaking countries, much to the confusion of fans. The player, Pete or Claire, is tasked with returning all 4 seasons to the valley, enlisting the help of the villagers, the harvest sprites, the harvest goddess, and the king of the underworld to accomplish this. Although the game attempted to incorporate popular trends like Minecraft-esque terrain squares, it forgot about what made Harvest Moon special in the first place. Time and time again, the Harvest Moon fandom had emphasized the importance of the game's dating sim mechanics, which are just as crucial as watering your crops and feeding your chickens. But in the Lost Valley, these complex relationships were simplified to quest-based friendships, resulting in rather shallow gameplay. Combined with technical issues, The Lost Valley received overwhelmingly negative reviews, an incredibly poor start to Natsume's solo series. In spite of repeated negative reception, Natsume has continued releasing games under the Harvest Moon name, with many taking inspiration from older installments of the franchise, but completely failing to capture the magic that made those games so successful to begin with. While Natsume was busy hijacking the Harvest Moon name, Marvelous sought to continue the series on their own terms, resulting in Bokujo Monogatari being rebranded to Story of Seasons outside of Japan. The first game under this new title was released in 2014 for the 3DS, and unlike Natsume's first attempt, it had a similar premise as the original Harvest Moon games, with the protagonist, John or Annie, working to transform the rundown farm into a peaceful haven. The game was by no means revolutionary, but considering all the drama happening behind the scenes, it could have been a lot worse. It also performed surprisingly well, becoming the top-selling game in Japan in March 2014 with 131,000 units sold. Besides making new content, the Story of Seasons franchise has also released several remakes of the original Harvest Moon games, including Friends of Mineral Town and A Wonderful Life, marking the return of many fan-favorite characters like Celia, Potpourri, and Karen. The games are also far more inclusive, allowing players to marry any of the available characters regardless of gender. While Natsume and Marvelous were busy playing tug-of-war over Harvest Moon, another farming game was about to come onto the scene and blow them both completely out of the water. Developed single-handedly by Eric Barone, aka Concerned Ape, 2016's Stardew Valley was heavily inspired by the Harvest Moon franchise, with Barone setting out to address the shortcomings of the series, saying that he had felt that it had gotten progressively worse following 1999's Back to Nature. Barone was also inspired by Animal Crossing, Rune Factory, Minecraft, and Terraria, and added popular features from those games like crafting, quests, and combat to Stardew Valley. In the first 2 weeks of its release, Stardew Valley sold over 400,000 copies, successfully filling the void Harvest Moon had left behind. And as of March 2022, Stardew Valley has sold more than 20 million copies across all platforms, far outselling the game it had taken inspiration from. As big a fan I am of some of the Harvest Moon games, none hold a candle to Stardew Valley, which I've probably spent over 300 hours playing. It's honestly a problem. The game features the familiar premise of the player inheriting their deceased grandfather's farm in a town known as Stardew Valley. Much like Harvest Moon, the players can grow crops, raise livestock, fish, cook, mine, forage, and socialize with the townspeople, but in a far more interactive and entertaining manner. Although the vast majority of Harvest Moon games had 3D graphics, Stardew Valley paid homage to the franchise's humble beginnings with a colorful, pixelated art style, furthering that sense of nostalgia. Besides having far superior customization to any installment of Harvest Moon, as well as countless updates that kept you coming back for more, Stardew Valley also allowed for 4-person multiplayer, letting you play competitively or collaboratively. Not to mention that the game is completely open-ended, meaning you can keep playing on a single save file forever if you wanted to. When asked about the popularity of Stardew Valley, Yasuhiro Wada stated that he was very happy with the game, as it proved that Harvest Moon/Story of Seasons was by no means a forgotten series. He also applauded Barone on retaining the sense of freedom that he had sought to capture in the series that was unfortunately lost in later installments. In the wake of Stardew Valley, the farming game genre has absolutely exploded, and combined with the release of Animal Crossing New Horizons, has led to the rise of the cozy game, which, as the name implies, is a game that is more relaxing than it is stressful. Although as someone who breaks a sweat every time I enter Skull Cavern, I'm hesitant to label Stardew as such. Although Natsume's Harvest Moon series hasn't been received nearly as well as Story of Seasons, that might be changing. On September 26, 2023, they'll be releasing their 6th game, The Winds of Anthos, which is already receiving praise for being an improvement on their prior installments. I'm personally not drawn to the game since it looks like a knockoff of Breath of the Wild, but at least it seems to be a step in the right direction. Now 25 years old, the Harvest Moon/Story of Seasons franchise is still considered a legend in the gaming space, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone under the age of 20 who knows anything about them. They've released a bunch of games in the past decade, but are there any that can actually be called good? Although they pioneered the farming game genre, they're in a difficult position, as any attempt to revert back to their old 90s format would likely be seen as them copying Stardew Valley, even if they did it first. I personally wouldn't mind if Story of Seasons went back to the origins of the franchise in regard to its art style and gameplay, just with updates that made it more relevant for the modern era. Besides having a surprisingly dedicated fan base, the world is incredibly expansive, having hundreds of characters and dozens of settings that they could incorporate into one awesome storyline. I mean, if role players on Gaia Online could do it, why can't they? What would you be interested in seeing from Harvest Moon or Story of Seasons? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!